Got it. Got it.
You can't say.
Oh.
Okay. So welcome everyone, and we will with the shared screen. Welcome back. I'm trying to work around on recording. So I want to leave the mics open, but remember that if you've got noise going on in the background, we all hear it. So I will mute everybody if I have to, but that made the conversation easier last week not to have everyone muted. So please be sensitive and careful about that. Welcome back to Foundations for a Thoughtful Judaism and Introduction to Judaism. This is our second class. This is Peoplehood 2, the second unit we're having from the big group called Peoplehood. It comes from Unit 2, Class 1. This is called Multiple Entrances and Multiple Belongings. So first, I will stop the share for a moment. Is there anybody who is new this week? I know there were at least 2 more people coming, plus there were people who signed up last week who did not make it. Anyone new this week? Okay, so Mark, you had a friend. I sent him the information, but I don't see him on right now. I'm glad you had a friend. It's nice to have a friend.
Yeah, I did.
This was a David Weber or somebody?
David Weber, he's an assistant professor of communications at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington
Okay. So
for 50 years.
Hopefully he'll join us later. And,
Yes.
I'll admit him when we do. So we are going to carry on. So I'll go back to the share screen. Let's open with the bracha for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav, tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, the ever-present, our God, sovereign of all time and space, who brings holiness to our lives through the mitzvah of living out words of Torah. So last week I showed these frequently asked questions about the Shalom Hartman Institute and about what Foundations for a Thoughtful Judaism is as its program. We talked about Judaism as an interpretive tradition, pluralism, and the use of big ideas. We did a quick overview, which I'm doing even more quickly now, of the entire curriculum. We looked at the Peoplehood unit. Last week's unit comes from Peoplehood Unit 1, Class 1, Being and Becoming. Tonight's is Unit 2, Class 1, Multiple Entrances and Multiple Belongings. In the next few weeks, we are taking 2 units from Faith. Next week will be Understanding Faith, Class 1, Pathways to Faith, and then Faith and Trust. From Practice, we are doing the concept of choice and commandment. And from Ethics, we are going to try to bridge creation ethics and covenantal ethics. I'll try to tackle both. For the podcasts as background, last week, I think I was not able to show this link. I will share this with you as a PDF after tonight's class, and you can then go to the podcasts for Peoplehood. There is supposed to be 3. The first 2 are relevant to our first 2 classes, but the only one that's there so far is Peoplehood and Place. It is worthwhile anyway, but it's not directly relevant. The first 2, what is Jewish peoplehood and the boundaries of Jewish peoplehood, will be coming up shortly. Anybody have anything you'd like to share as a review from last week? Okay, that's probably a bad sign.
Well, wait,
Any reaction?
I can share something, Rabbi.
Thanks, Carol.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was going to say this at the end of last time, but there was no time or space. So I wanted to say that basically all my life, I have been aware of being Jewish, being from a family where my father's Jewish, being surrounded by Jewish people, but they didn't practice or really attend services. I just went to, bar mitzvahs and things like that. So this class and the last couple of years of attending synagogue have been a process of learning more about what it is like to become Jewish and actually practice the faith. So that's one of the reasons why Jennifer and I signed up for this. And so I just wanted to say that I thought the discussion of those two concepts was very useful. Eloquently put.
I'm delighted to hear that. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Carol. Rachel, I saw you nodding. Anything you wanted to add?
She said it really well. I agree with everything she said, and I feel the same way. And I married into a Jewish family. I am Jewish myself, but I married into a very Jewish family. I call my husband a super Jew. And so I'm really glad that I'm here so that I can share in more of what his life is like as well. So thanks.
It's interesting. Jewish life is so imbibed with the doing of things that you may get, and Hartman is so focused on like the big ideas, you may get a framework for looking at things that is going to be sort of helpful but not familiar to him. You may call him very Jewish, but you're going to come in with the sort of, he may do the what and the how, but you may have more of a sense of a why after this.
And I love knowing more than he does, so that's going to be very helpful for me.
I'll do my best. Okay. Any other opening thoughts or review? Thank you very much. Thanks, Rachel, from Lenox, Massachusetts, and the Berkshires, gateway to the Berkshires. Okay, going back to the share screen. Review. Tonight's topic is multiple entrances and multiple belongings. This is about, well, let's do the framework here. In the previous unit, we described the phenomena of Jewish peoplehood. In this unit, we ask what it means to be part of the people. Let me put it in a different way. The previous unit described the idea of Jewish peoplehood. This unit describes the experience of being part of the Jewish people. In fact, the idea of how to come in. How does one gain entry to the Jewish people? How does belonging to a subgroup of a people relate to being part of the larger whole? And those are sessions we aren't going to get to. What does loyalty to a people entail, especially when different groups within a people may be far from each other geographically, culturally, and ideologically? And those are also beyond the sessions that we will have a chance to get to in this 6-week introduction. Let's open with a discussion, though. Just a couple of opening initial questions, and I can, once you get the questions, I can go back to us being able to see each other. How does one join the Jewish people? The next question, the second one, is a kind of complicated one. How is an entry point a value statement? Now, I want to rephrase that in case you don't understand that question. There are certain ways into people, but there are obviously choices about how you join, right? And the choices about how you join a people, that because it's a choice, it means you could have chosen this or you could have chosen that. That means it's a value statement. So how are the entry points into Jewish life a value statement? And what is the best modern analogy for joining the Jewish people? So I don't know if you have all three questions. How does one join? How is an entry point a value statement? And what's the best analogy? So I'm going to stop the share. So how does one join the Jewish people?
Well, we learned in Torah study last week that if you're born into a Jewish family, you're part of the Jewish people.
Okay, so to some extent, one joins by birth,
Or become a Jew by choice.
That is partially an answer. Jews by choice, and to some extent, tonight's session is about coming in from outside and the different ways to do that. But so what do you know about how you join the Jewish people?
Showing up.
Showing up. I would say that in places with shrinking Jewish populations, in places with desperate Jewish need, or even in Israel, to some extent, just being there goes a long way. It doesn't go all the way for everybody. There are those who spend a lot of time sort of making fine line distinctions and reading some people in and some people out. But showing up is a very important component of this identity. What else?
Celebrating holidays.
Holidays. So there's so showing up is a kind of presence. The other, sharing holidays, is a shared experience of the way you frame time. Go ahead.
You could convert. Conversion.
Conversion. So we'll talk about what that involves in a couple of minutes.
Contributing to Jewish causes, or Jewish foundations, or the congregation itself.
Okay, so institutions. So far we have relationships, we have calendar, we have institutions. Okay.
Observing Shabbat.
I would put observing Shabbat as part of the rhythm and cycle of the calendar, although a reminder that Shabbat is considered the most important Jewish holiday because it is the most frequent, not the opposite, right? Marilyn.
Simply growing up in a Jewish environment.
So
I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood.
Right.
In a school that had mostly Jewish children. So it isn't that I necessarily chose anything. I was immersed in it without even knowing what I was immersed in until.
Let me be very clear about this point. This is the Lenny Bruce point. Right? Lenny Bruce, who says, if you're from New York, you're Jewish. It doesn't matter if you're Catholic. If you're from South Dakota, you're Goyish. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish. Right? No, I think that's clearly wrong. And those of us who live in isolated Jewish communities can attest to that. But Marilyn, you are talking about something very powerful. Let's take the Jewish person who comes from that environment and who wants their kids to have a Jewish identity. And it could be, Carol, certain places in Detroit were so overwhelmingly Jewish, right? You come from a Jewish neighborhood where everything around you is Jewish, the smell of the deli, this, right? And you want your kids to have a Jewish identity. And you marry somebody who is from a completely different background, and you think that you can pass on that identity automatically. The thing is, that neighborhood no longer exists. Even in New York, that neighborhood barely exists. Maybe in certain places in Toronto, right?
Montreal, maybe.
Maybe Montreal, which, you know, Canada being a tossed salad, not a melting pot, but it's fading. You can't have the experience by osmosis that included the immigrant story of everybody's parents who were all around them when those parents are no longer there. Even if the neighborhood does still exist, the deli has moved. It's become sushi, right?
The power.
I remember calling my dad on one of my confirmation trips to New York and say, I'm calling you from the Starbucks on the Lower East Side. He says, you're calling me from the what? Where? Right? Sorry, Marilyn, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. We should raise our hands so we don't have to.
Oh, that's fine.
But it's just that, like, the power of our synagogue in St. Thomas is what affiliated my family with Judaism.
So as a reform rabbi, you've just made my point that even if you come from, last week we talked about folk and faith, or being and becoming. Even if you come from a Judaism of being and it was all around you, if you want to pass on a Jewish identity, you have to take certain actions, make certain choices. It has to be what was unconscious for some of us in growing up, has to become a conscious choice to pass it on to another generation. That's the
But
main.
it has to be available in a powerful way, the way this synagogue was available and became powerful just by walking into it and people being involved. And at that time, there being a number of children that your own children could integrate. So it's
And
a matter.
I have to tell you that living here now, witnessing 0 Jewish children on the island take their kids keep their kids home from school for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is not a formula for passing on an identity to a next generation.
No.
You know, there needs to be a minimum. So, okay, let me go on.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I was going to say, assisting somebody who's Jewish. You know, you may not be Jewish yourself, but if you help somebody shop or cook or listen to their stories, that's a great way to belong or become part of the Jewish community.
Our third category tonight is going to deal with that. And Peter, Kendra, actually, I hope she's here or can come near you. Is she away tonight?
And, you know, unfortunately, she's not feeling all that well, so she's not going to join us today.
The
But I do
category
want to say, hang on a second. I do want to say I have a couple comments here. I'm going to push back a little bit on the just showing up business, and which I don't disagree with, but I think it's not complete. And secondly, there's an unstated assumption in what you've been saying, which is that the point of being Jewish is to pass that on to the next generation. And so I think the question is that the point of Judaism? It may be, but I want to make that explicit because I certainly heard that. I grew up in New York City, so I guess right, Lenny Bruce, I'm Jewish no matter what, right? Okay, but I grew up in a secular household. We had a Christmas tree. We didn't even call it a Hanukkah bush. We called it a Christmas tree. I didn't go to synagogue. I didn't have religious training. I considered myself Jewish, but I wasn't sure it really counted because what the heck did I know, right? And it wasn't until later, really, as a young adult, that it became important to me to find out what is this Jewish thing, and then it became an important part of my life going forward. But I think people come to it in a lot of different ways.
That is one of the points tonight.
I would separate out. How does one come to being Jewish? And then this question of how does one pass it on? What does that mean?
Okay, so we will come, the passing, I would say that passing it on is a point of being Jewish. It's not the point of being Jewish. So we will, but what I wanted to say is that Kendra mentioned last week a category which we're actually dealing with exclusive, what's the word? Directly in tonight's session. So let me go back to the share screen and whoops, there we go. We did not get to the other part of this question, which is what's the best modern analogy for joy? So let me go to question 2 first. How is the beginning or an ending of something a value statement? So I may want to skip the beginning part because we're dealing with entering into Judaism and multiple ways of doing that tonight. I do want to make, by contrast, the idea of the destination a quick point. How do we wind up? Where do we wind up as a value statement? So, Peter, interesting. You asked, what is the point of Judaism? Obviously that's a loaded question.
I was stretching a point here.
So what is a point of Judaism? Let's put it this way: what do we consider a point for life? And in the traditions that do develop the idea of life after death, which is much less emphasized in Judaism than in Christianity, but I would say that the question of how you get into the world to come whatever you think about the world to come, and I'm not sure it exists, but how you get into the world to come is a value statement, just as an example. So in Christianity, classically, how do you get into the world to come? Let's take Protestantism for the moment, leaving Peter out of it. How do you get into the world to come? How do you live forever? Oversimplification of classic Protestantism. How do you get into the next world?
Baptism?
Don't do bad things.
Yeah, that's so Jewish of you. How do you get into the world to come? Classical Protestantism as an oversimplification.
Faith alone. It's
Getting
predestined.
baptized?
Faith alone. Faith alone. Belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, period, full stop, end of story. Catholicism adds faith and good works, but they're both necessary. Actually, since Catholicism came first, I should say Protestantism takes that out, right?
Right.
The idea of belief alone, remember last week I said as an oversimplification, Christianity is about what you believe. Judaism, how do you earn a place in the world to come? And first of all, I will admit that it's not, we don't talk about it that much. But it does, the concept does exist. So in classical Judaism, how do you earn a place in the world to come?
Good works.
Good works by making this place a better place than it was before you got here.
So do you need to like bagels to do that?
Doesn't hurt.
Do you need to be Jewish to do that? Jews believe that all moral human beings of all beliefs, all faiths, earn a place in the world to come. We get into the world to come based on our actions, right?
Following the 10 Commandments.
Well, 10 Commandments and maybe a few more. The goal, therefore, the end point, if you will, when the religion states where its goal and where you're going and how you get there, that is a value statement. It is also true that it is a value statement of how the religion states you come in. And that is what we are looking at tonight, 3 different versions of a value statement for how you come in. Now, Peter, you're disqualified. What is this picture? What is it a picture of?
Must be something in Buffalo.
Is that the Peace Bridge?
I know, yes.
Yes.
Somebody said,
This
hooray.
is the Peace Bridge in Buffalo, New York. The Peace Bridge connects what 2 communities?
Okay, Peter, you can say it now.
Yeah, Peter. you can say
East
it.
Buffalo and West Buffalo.
Buffalo, New York,
Yeah, guys look at it. Yeah.
and Fort Erie, Ontario. It is an international border. When we think of becoming Jewish, I want to tip my hand and say that I think that the best single, okay, I'm admitting Ellen Garrick coming in now, and I will say about Ellen, as a reminder, that she now heads the organization called the National Center to Encourage Judaism. And Ellen, I don't know if you can hear me yet, but this is a class about different ways to come into Judaism. The analogy that I find speaks the most deeply to me is the reason why I put the Peace Bridge up here as a picture. And that is the modern analogy of citizenship. Now, when we look at coming into Judaism, when you think about the formal conversion process, which is actually just one of the 3 ways we're going to look at tonight. In order to become, let's take an example of somebody who's born in Chinatown in New York, who's born in Chinatown, who is surrounded her entire life by people who are Chinese, who does not learn English, who does not, who gets a job, works hard, but does not pay taxes, and is born in Chinatown. Can that person vote?
Yes,
Is that person a citizen?
yes.
Okay, now let's take somebody who's born in Fort Erie, Ontario. And when they're 4 days old, their parents move across the Peace Bridge and come into Buffalo. That person grows up, serves in the United States Army, pays taxes. The only community they know is Buffalo. The only language they know is English. Can that person vote?
No.
Were
No.
their parents American?
Citizenship and a few other issues. Maybe if they're Mitt Romney, they can.
Well, right, if they're Mitt Romney, they can, okay.
Was
No,
the-
they cannot. If they're,
They
if
only
they're-
vote-
if they're-
In order,
Wait a second.
in order to become a citizen,
English as opposed to Canadian? What do you mean?
what?
They weren't born in the United States, so unless they did something, no, they cannot vote.
no, unless their parents were United States
Were the
citizens,
parent, that's right, were the parents American?
Let's imagine they were not. So for
And they
the
cannot
purpose
vote.
Oh,
So it's a
to
no.
become a citizen of this country, you have to know something and you have to promise something that somebody who is born here does not need to know and does not need to promise. In some ways, that's not fair. But that is the way that our community has decided is the entrance point in. So now let's keep that in the back of our minds, and let's go to on into our three texts tonight. How does one join the Jewish people? In the modern nation state, we have a model of belonging that's based on citizenship. But even citizenship is a process that has different aspects. A person may be a citizen because they were born in that country. Alternatively, they may go through a naturalization process that can involve the osmosis and acculturation of living in the country and learning about its history and laws. Yet another path to citizenship is through marrying a citizen of a country. When we look at the Jewish people today, how people join and what makes them feel a sense of belonging, we see important parallels to the modern experience of becoming a citizen. In this session, we'll look at three joining paradigms, each of which emphasizes a different path to entry into the Jewish people. So, source number one from the Book of Ruth. As a quick background, the Book of Ruth is in the Jewish section of the Hebrew Bible, which is called the Writings. And it is the story of a family the story is told towards the beginning. So we're going to read the first 18 verses. Who would like to read?
I'll read. In the
Go
days,
ahead. Go
in
ahead.
in the days when the chieftains ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons went to reside in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and his 2 sons were named Mahlon and Chilion.
Don't need to worry about them, as you'll see in a minute. Go ahead.
Of Bethlehem in Judah. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived there for about 10 years. Then these 2, Mahlon and Chilion, also died. So the woman was left without her 2 sons and without her husband.
Go ahead.
She started out with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for in the country of Moab she had heard that the Lord had taken note of his people and given them food. Accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and they set out on the road back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Turn back, each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband." And she kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore sons.
Go ahead.
Should you wait for them to grow up? Should you, on their account, debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me. They broke
By
into
the way, what institution is she referring to as about her having more sons for them to marry?
That levirate marriage?
Levirate marriage, which is called in Hebrew yibumah, and I'm saying that for a reason, which I'll come back to later. It's not a major reason tonight, but okay, go ahead.
They broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, see, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go follow your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her.
Those words are almost 3,000 years old, and I still take my breath away. What motivates, let me ask you this. First of all, does this pass the Bechdel test? In order to answer that
Yes.
question,
I have to know what the test is.
what's the Bechdel test?
What is it?
Anyone?
I don't know what the test is.
That's when women
It's
tell.
two women have a conversation that does not revolve around a man.
That's correct. That is when two women in a story, a piece of fiction, art, novel, movie, have a conversation that does not revolve around a man. Does this pass the Bechdel test?
Yes.
Yes.
I think so. It sort of revolves around a man in that their status revolved around men, but I think it does pass the Bechdel test. Okay, that's not relevant to our class. I just threw that in there.
Well, because Ruth is saying, I don't care whether you have any more sons, I'm going to stick with you. So therefore, it's not about the men, it's about us.
Okay, so yes, it passes the Bechdel test. Okay, what motivates Ruth here?
Love.
Interestingly enough,
Loyalty.
love for
Devotion, I think.
Love for Ruth, love for her time with her, love for her husband.
Kinship.
Okay.
Family.
Dedication.
Loyalty.
Yeah, okay. And of course, we have here something very powerful, which is that, share. There we go. Does her statement reflect the Judaism of being or the Judaism of becoming?
Becoming.
Well, doesn't she nail both right on the head? Your people shall be my people, and your God
Your
shall
God,
be
my God. Yeah.
Right? Okay. What communities have you joined based on personal relationships? And what communities have you joined for ideological reasons?
Talking about organizations?
Sure.
ACLU, the NRA.
Yeah, okay, Mark, I know you, so I know you can say both of those in one breath. You've taken other people's breath away by saying both of them in one breath, but yes. What communities have you joined based on ideological reasons? Okay. What about based on personal relationships? I actually joined Rotary based on personal relationships.
Elks Lodge.
Elks Lodge, okay.
Boy Scouts.
Boy Scouts, there's no connection.
We joined the synagogue based on both.
Yes.
Join the synagogue based on both. Right. Interesting. Okay.
Yes.
Are there advantages of joining a community based on personal relationships?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what are they?
It's networking, maybe for a job
yeah.
or whatever.
It
You move
feels
to some place,
very
if you move to some place, you know absolutely no one, and I've done that twice. All right, both here on St. Thomas, and when my wife and I moved from Los Angeles to Sonora, we knew one person in Sonora, and working helped us get established as people of the community.
Okay, are there disadvantages for joining for personal relationships rather than through a formal process?
Sure, if you end up joining the Ku Klux Klan.
Right. When we were in Erie, our dry cleaner was Catholic, but she said that she went to, Julie, you remember this? She went to the megachurch, the Protestant fundamentalist evangelical born again megachurch down the road. Why?
She had friends there.
No relationships.
Because they made her feel good. A lot of what is going on in religious communities now, in a world in which we feel far apart from one another, we emphasize relationship a great deal because we are lonely and we are apart. But a lot of this relationship-based stuff makes ideas secondary. It puts people together because they're nice to each other who may not, in fact, have the same values at all in the long run.
But that can be a good thing because it can take you out of your bubble where you only interact with people that agree with you and have some opportunity to interact with people that don't actually agree with you, but you can see them as people. I mean, that's part of the problem we have, is that we isolate ourselves in little groups of people who won't share our views.
It's interestingly, when you look at how many Jewish communities a community should have, or even how many churches, right? When there was one parish in an entire district, everybody had to join it, or one synagogue, right? You brought together under one roof people who had very different approaches from each other.
What about?
What?
I was going to say, what about in St. Thomas? My children went to the Anglican school. They didn't go to public school. They didn't go to a Catholic school. They didn't go to any other school. They went to the Anglican school, and yet we were Jewish, and yet the atmosphere was very, very good, and they let us observe the Jewish holidays, and we chose to share with them.
Sometimes better than the public schools do.
I think so.
Who was that who was speaking?
Andrea.
Andrea, okay, hi. Slightly different than the point I was making at the moment about in today's world with both television stations, news stations, and our spiritual communities, we have an extreme level of catering to ideological affinity. And so unlike the idea when there's one synagogue in a town and everybody has to accommodate each other, you know, once you have breakaways over ideological reasons, the people who believe this go here, the people who believe this go here, people who believe this go there, and you can get you can get much of an echo chamber. So this question of how you join, whether it's relationship or agreement, there are advantages to both. The second text comes from the Talmud, and I'm going to ask Mark Borden to read this. No, just kidding.
No,
go to the next page. So just as a reminder, what is the Talmud? The Talmud is the compendium of Jewish life and law, which acts like a law book but isn't. It is a combination of two different documents, but that combination happened in two different places. Is everybody with me? Mm-hmm. So the first part of the Talmud is called the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is compiled It's in good, clear rabbinic Hebrew, and it is compiled in the year 200 by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, although much of the work for it was done by Rabbi Akiva. And it is published, and there's one version of it, and it sort of lays out what the Judaism of the early 3rd century is like, the early 3rd century of the Common Era. It's published in the year 200. But as soon as it's published, there are arguments about it, because there are people who had traditions that weren't included in it, or new things came up. The Mishnah is in Hebrew, but there are arguments about it in Aramaic. In the year 400, a collection of those arguments is published in Tiberias, which is misleadingly called, because Tiberias is not this city, it is misleadingly called the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Yerushalmi, or it is known as the Palestinian Talmud, or the Talmud of the land of Israel. And it is the Mishnah in Hebrew, plus the Aramaic reactions for 2 centuries to it. It's published because there's some persecution, and they're afraid all the traditions are going to get lost. In the meantime, though, there's no persecution in Babylonia, and they're still talking. There's persecution in the year 500. So in the year 500, guess what? The Aramaic discussions about the Mishnah in the land of Babylon are then published. That's called the
Babylonian
Talmud, or the Talmud, because the Babylonian Talmud becomes the standard. So if you just use the term Babylonian, you are referring to the Babylonian Talmud. Now, how many of you didn't know all of this that I told you just now?
I didn't.
I didn't.
Okay, so this is new to some of you. This is the basis of Jewish law. Most Jews by the year 500 were living outside of the land of Israel. That's another reason why the Babylonian Talmud, which addressed more things about outside of Israel, that becomes the standard. There's a very interesting legal question about what is the status of the Jerusalem Talmud. And now that there is in Israel, there's renewed interest in the Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud. And it's unclear, how that's going to play out in the long run. But the Talmud then is the Mishnah, which says this is what Judaism is, and the Gemara, which often says, how did you get that from the Torah? Because that's not very clear from the Torah. Like the Torah, doesn't talk about a conversion process, right? Even the Book of Ruth, which is in the Bible, which seems about her joining the Jewish people, doesn't say how she did it. So now what we get to in Tractate Yevamot, and Yevamot means Yibum, or levirate marriage. This is the tractate which starts out talking, the Mishnah at least talks about levirate marriage. If you die and you don't have any children, your widow has to marry your brother, right? And their first child will have your name, not theirs. That is what levirate marriage is. And then if you don't want to do it, there's a whole procedure, and it goes into a lot of detail. So that is what the Mishnah is about. But the Gemara, let's put it this way: both Talmuds have OCD or ADHD. They wander. They don't make sometimes they don't even. The Talmud presents as a law book, but it doesn't always give you the final answer. It sometimes forgets the question, right? So there's a lot of distraction. It makes a very good training for lawyers, because you have to use fine logic in order to follow what they're doing. But this one's fairly straightforward. So from the Talmud, the Bible never develops a procedure for conversion, but it's becoming more common for people to want to join the Jewish people. So what's not legislated in the Bible, the rabbis of the Talmud are the first to turn this into a formalized process. So who wants to read?
All right, I'll read.
Our rabbis taught
if at the present time a person desires to become a ger, equals convert, address the candidate as follows. What reason have you for desiring to become a ger? Don't you
Ger.
know that
Ger is how you pronounce it.
Ger?
And that's the Hebrew term for convert.
Don't you know that people of Israel at the present time are persecuted and oppressed, despised, harassed, and overcome by afflictions?
First of all, this is fascinating, right? This is not Jehovah's Witnesses going door to door saying, I promise you the kingdom of heaven. This is, are you sure you want to do this? Right? Right? This is at a time, this precedes the time when if you convert to Judaism, you'll be killed, your teacher will be killed. If you're caught, your teacher will be killed and anybody near them will be killed, right? But this is not, I'm knocking on your door in order to save your soul, right? Go ahead, if the candidate.
Doesn't Judaism it doesn't seek converts? In Judaism, we don't seek to convert people. In fact, we dissuade them from becoming a Jew unless they really.
The tradition is you have to turn somebody away twice, and then they have to make them ask 3 times. Let's put it this way. We are so reeling in numbers. We are so in need of people that I think, don't do that now. And I'm perfectly happy taking money from the National Center to Encourage Judaism to promote Jewish life in the hope that many people will find it appealing, right? So and yet we do make people read a lot of books, so maybe that's our form of discouraging them.
Historically, though, before Christian persecutions of Jews, I believe that Jews were very active in soliciting new Jews.
In the pre-Christian era, yes, and there was a time when up to 10% of the Roman Empire was either Jewish or sort of fellow travelers. But let's put it this way: we forcibly converted the Idumeans, and we live to regret it, because from the Idumeans, who we forced to become Jewish, comes Herod, who might have been a quote unquote Jewish king, but we didn't like him very much, and he didn't like us very much. So there was a time when Jews engaged in proactive conversion. It did not last very long.
There are a number of Roman poets who complained about Jews soliciting people in the forum.
Right, and this passage, this attitude here may be a reaction to that earlier history. All right, so go ahead. I think Karen was reading. If the candidate replies.
I know, and yet am unworthy, accept him, her immediately.
Fascinating.
And let him or her.
And then there's a little bit more here, but that's less cumbersome. Then, all right, go ahead.
Then let him or her know some of the minor and some of the major commandments equals mitzvah. Inform him or her of the sin of forgetting to leave the gleanings of your field, the forgotten sheaf, the peck equals the corner of your field set aside for the poor to harvest, and the poor's teeth, minimally 10% of your harvest.
I would say, by the way, that these are examples of what the minor and major commandments are, not that you have to use these specific ones. What's fascinating about that is that I learned from my associate rabbi when I was in Maryland. He always would ask, when we did a conversion, ask people to say what some of the most difficult parts about becoming Jewish were and what some of the easiest parts were. And what was fascinating about that is, by not specifying, sometimes you had people say that something was easy that the last person we had interviewed said was hard, and vice versa. It's fascinating. So keep going. They inform him.
They inform him or her of the punishments and rewards for mitzvah. We do not elaborate too long on the mitzvah, nor enter into too many stringent details.
All right. So we go into from what some of the commandments are, which is knowledge. We go into some of the consequences of Jewish life, which I guess you could call commitment. Go ahead.
he accepted he is circumcised forthwith. As soon as he is healed, arrangements are made for his immediate immersion. 2 scholars stand with him or her during the immersion and inform him or her of some of the easy and some of the difficult mitzvot. When he comes up after his immersion, he is deemed to be an Israelite in all respects.
Okay, and obviously for a woman, there's no equivalent of the circumcision part. This, however, in rabbinic circles is referred to as dipim and tipim, with my apologies. But what are the 3 elements that you see here? Do you know that Jewish life is, that Jews are, you have to have a sense of solidarity with the Jewish people. You have to have some knowledge, and you have to have some commitment. These are the elements here. Any reactions or thoughts here?
I have a question. It's Julie. You didn't, so they just said circumcision. You didn't mention that as one of the 3 things. Is it?
I was looking at the values that they were talking about, but that is the equivalent of the raise your right hand, I suppose. And that's the equivalent of the swearing in, I guess. I mean, according to Jewish life and law, you need 3 things for a conversion. Circumcision if you're male, which is not present if you're not. Immersion, and the acceptance of the, bulk of the commandments. Those are the 3 things.
So if you're born Jewish, it's assumed that the male is circumcised. But if for some reason one were not, someone born of Jewish parents would still be considered Jewish, even if he were not circumcised. But somebody who was converting would have to be circumcised?
Don't ask me difficult questions.
That's an interesting point.
It's a very, very good question.
There was just an article by a former Soviet person who was of Jewish descent, and a lot of Russian Jews in the 70s and 80s did not have their sons circumcised.
In Buffalo, who was it? Shalom Pless, Peter, Dr. Pless, who did a lot of the Russian circumcisions. It is not, I've.
When they emigrated.
I'm sorry, I don't want to get distracted by the whole circumcision discussion.
I'm sure the Talmud does not have an answer to this question because it's a modern question, it would have been unheard of.
I don't want to get distracted by that. That would take us a half hour, and there's a lot to talk about it.
Okay.
The reform movement could have gotten rid of circumcision as part of Jewish life and didn't. That's all I'll say. There's a lot of there's too much. There's too much there. We've got a long way to go. I'm a little behind, and I needed to end by 8:20 tonight, and I'm not on schedule to do that yet. So, the process of conversion that's outlined here has underlying values: solidarity with the people, some knowledge, some sense of commitment. I guess you could call getting circumcised an expression of commitment for a man.
Big time.
Yeah. So let's go on to the.
By the way, just a quick comment. I think that the conversion process is extremely powerful. A close friend of mine converted, and so I got to kind of watch him through it, and it was very, very powerful. And as I mentioned before, I kind of grew up in a Jewish family that didn't really practice, and I was a little jealous of my friend who had gone through all this stuff to convert. I said, "Boy, you certainly feel Jewish by the end of it." Let me just put it that way.
this is a great lead-in to what I wanted to do next, which is not part of the Hartman curriculum. It's part of the teaching that I have done for many years, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's on topic here. So you'll get your chance here to talk about that, Peter, directly, whether it's a male friend or a female friend. For the moment, let's imagine you're a Jewish woman. You have a close friend, born Christian, who's involved with a Jewish man. She has all kinds of questions and is thinking about exploring conversion, but she is afraid to approach the rabbi because we are very scary. And therefore, she goes to you and she asks your opinion. What 10 things should she have to know or should she have to do in order to become Jewish? Okay, take a minute, scratch some things down. What 10 things do you think somebody should have to know or have to do in order to become Jewish? David Weber just coming in now, welcome. The question is, what 10 things should you have to know or should you have to do in order to become Jewish?
Holidays.
Major holiday.
All right, do you want to take a minute quietly and write some things down and then we'll share?
The concept of mitzvah, the concept of tzedakah.
I am, as I said, running a little late today, so we'll cut off the amount of time I was going to give you. So yeah, some of the ideas we've had already, go ahead and share.
Dietary laws.
Concept of mitzvah.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
that's right. Yes.
The idea of commandment. A commandment, by the way, not a choice, right? A mitzvah is not a suggestion. Mitzvah means a commandment. The question is, who is the commander? How do we feel commanded? Who tells us? Is it internal? Is it external? That's a different issue. But even in Reform Judaism, the concept of mitzvah as commandment, not choice, commandment is crucial. Okay, dietary laws. Now, I don't think that anybody has to, keep completely kosher in order to become Jewish, but how we eat and Jewish foods are very important parts of Jewish life. So what might you start with as a typical example of a Jewish food that is a commandment that you would encourage?
The filter fish.
Oh.
You have the right holiday.
Don't eat seafood.
Gefilte fish.
The filter fish.
The filter fish has this in it.
Matzah. Matzah meal.
Matzah is a commandment on Pesach. So in talking about the dietary laws, you might start with matzah, right? The person should know what some of the others are, but anyway, there's no right or wrong answers here. All right, go ahead. Other ideas.
Observing Shabbat. Observance of, I was good.
Shabbat.
Great minds, observance
All
of
right,
Shabbat.
observing Shabbat.
Holidays.
Shabbat and holidays. The
Right.
rhythm of Jewish time and calendar. Okay, what else?
The concept
Children
of-
brought up Jewish.
What?
The history of the Jews.
History.
Tzedakah.
Highlights and tragedies.
Hmm.
Tzedakah. Commandment to make the world better. Okay, go ahead.
Children be brought up Jewish.
Children, if you have them. Every conversion procedure that I know of, if somebody is becoming Jewish, unless they are the only person becoming Jewish in a family that already exists, that is not Jewish. That's an interesting asterisk here. Raise as Jews. Next, anything else?
How about a
Symbols? Jewish symbols?
Monotheism.
What about the mikveh? Where would the mikveh fit in?
Well, depending on whether you think it's symbolic or a commandment, it could fit in, but we can list that as symbolic of the living a complete Jewish life. I'm going to put it here as an example here. Mikveh. Okay.
What about
Language?
circumcision?
So you could have milah, which is the word for circumcision. Somebody say language.
Yes.
I think that Hebrew has an important role. Notice that I said Hebrew and not Yiddish. So I think that, okay. So I'm going to say one thing at the end here, but let's take a look at a friend of mine who put these together. So these are very short, so please volunteer to read. Look at what somebody else came up with. And this is my modification of it. So number one, somebody want to read?
Kindle Shabbat candles symbolizes our commitment to begin to observe Shabbat at home and in the synagogue.
Okay, number two.
The mezuzah symbolizes our commitment to having a Jewish home. Yom Kippur observance, fasting and attending synagogue to symbolize our commitment to observe the high holy days and the festivals.
So we already have Shabbat covered by number one. This is highly specific. I might have just been more general here, but this is an example of like specific things that are symbolic of larger things. Number four.
Tzedakah, the commitment to give of ourselves, our time, and our resources according to our ability in pursuit of tikkun olam, making the world a better place.
Five.
Worship, the commitment to a regular prayer worship experience. Education, each individual must present an outline or plan for continuing Jewish education. Affiliation, the commitment to join a synagogue and become an active member of the Jewish community. Dietary laws, kashrut, explore aspects of the dietary laws in a way which reflects their importance in Jewish life. Explore the importance of eating matzah and not eating chometz, leavened products during Pesach, Passover as a core Jewish identity marker. Love of Israel, explore and understand the importance of Israel and Zionism for Jewish identity in Jewish history and as a core aspect of the Jewish religious experience. Understand the role of peoplehood as part of Jewish identity. Explore the complexities of the modern state of Israel and understand that support for Israel as an expression of one's own Jewish values can come about a wide array of organizations representing overlapping or even seemingly divergent places on a political spectrum.
That's a fancy way of saying support Israel as a polity, meaning their existence of Israel doesn't mean supporting every Israeli government's policy.
Raise one's children as Jews, the commitment to teach them faithfully to your children, and should you be blessed with children, to raise them exclusively and actively in the Jewish faith.
So this was originally done by a rabbi in Denver named Stephen Foster. It was adopted by my colleague and friend, Rabbi Arnold Gluck, and I have adopted it and changed it from there. What I would say as a general statement for all of you, the answers that you gave, if you were telling somebody what you thought she should do in order to become Jewish or what she should learn, I hope apply in your own lives too, because these are by telling somebody what the entrance point is, you're identifying core values. Source number 3, the first way to come into Judaism is through relationship. That's the Book of Ruth. The second way is the Talmudic discussion of a formal procedure of affiliation and conversion. The third is the group that Kendra mentioned last week explicitly. And that group was the resident alien. It's a fascinating category, which we would call in modern terms the insider-outsider. So from source number 3, from the Book of Leviticus, Who wants to read this?
I'll read.
Go ahead.
When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I, the Lord, am your God.
By the way, I do not get what most Americans who claim to be, religious Christians do not get about this verse. Right? I just don't get it. I mean, what Bible are they reading that they treat immigrants the way they do? But all right, go ahead. Keep going.
You shall not falsify measures of length, weight, or capacity.
Yeah, I don't know why that verse is in there. But the stranger who resides with you shall be as one of your citizens. Reactions here? So are they one of your citizens?
Well, they should be.
Yes. They
Well,
should be.
maybe
Not sure.
maybe you have to go back to the Talmud, and that's the way they become a citizen, is through the full conversion process. But are they one of your citizens? No. But are they as one of your citizens? Yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna say.
So the question here is the status of the insider-outsider. Have you ever felt both an insider and an outsider to the Jewish community?
Yes, I have.
So let's talk about that and how, and what way do insiders and outsiders influence communities they are insider out of? And then we'll come back to the final two questions, and we'll have to stop shortly after that, but we're close to the end anyway. So have you ever felt an insider and an outsider as part of the Jewish community? Anyone?
Yes, I lived in Germany for 4 years. My husband's work took us there. And we lived in an area that was really pure German, except the neighbors were Jews, but they were German Jews. And they would not let their children play with my children because we were, quote, Americans. And therefore, they didn't take Judaism first, they took nationality first. And I even remember going to a German synagogue on the holidays, and no one would speak. No one would approach. And the only way I could follow Judaism and keep my kids engaged is go on the army base in Frankfurt, where the rabbi was an American, and they accepted us. We were outsiders in the German community, theoretically, but we were American citizens. And we went, and my kids could attend Sunday school there, and I could teach Sunday school within the army base. So that was outsider, insider, and I'll never forget the feeling of thinking, but we're all Jewish, but we're really not.
Well, that's fascinating. And I think that we are very good at drawing barriers and boundaries. And, there was an Orthodox rock group that did a song once that made fun of people who didn't know very much. And the song went, I've got the what page am I on in the prayer book blues. I've got the kid knows less than me in the prayer book blues. And I just hated it. I mean, what I try to teach people is that the secret to feeling more comfortable and not intimidated in a Jewish service is to realize that everybody feels uncomfortable and intimidated in a Jewish service. I mean, there's so many different traditions, and there's so many different, like you bow 3 times this way and you move and you shuckle and you move over. These are just tools. And I think that we can worship the tools, right? But if you hit, and it's true, tools are important. I don't play golf, I play mini golf. But if you hit your ball into a sand trap, there are some tools that are going to get your ball out of it, and others that won't, right? So tools are important, but they're just tools. And when we make people feel bad about what they know versus what they don't know, I mean, that's just an awful thing, whether the person is Jewish or not. So, I mean, and there are other Jewish settings. I know a lot about Jewish life. There are settings where I didn't know. I mean, in my former congregation, there was a Simchat Torah service, and I had an associate rabbi who I referred to earlier in a very good way. I cited some really wonderful Torah that I learned from him. But one Simchat Torah, he did something with the aliyot that, I mean, I'd never heard of it before. I'd never seen it before. I had never, he just did it spontaneously, and it was some Jewish custom of like auctioning off the aliyot on Simchat Torah. And okay, now I know it's a real Jewish custom, but I was like, I'm the senior rabbi of the congregation. I didn't know what was happening Jewishly. I've never been more embarrassed in a synagogue, than I was at that moment. It was awful. And so I know, and I try to avoid, I do in my own mind, at least in my former congregation, I viewed Friday night as a visitor's welcome, service, and Shabbat morning was more of a veteran service. People who came were more sort of regulars, but even so, even at a veteran service, people don't always know what's happening. And the best way to feel more comfortable is to realize that everybody feels uncomfortable. We're all in the same boat. That's one of the most important teachings that I have, which I forgot how that relates to the question was insider, outsider. What about, I would have, if Kendra had been here, I was going to put her on the spot and ask about ways in which she had felt as an insider.
Well, I mean, I think, I'm sorry Kendra's not here. You can ask her next time. As I said, I'm sorry she's not feeling well. Andrea, I just want to comment that one of the most, it's interesting, your experience with the military, one of the Yom Kippur services that I remember the most was actually spending it at West Point. My son went to West Point, and I was there over the high holidays, and so worshiped there, which was a very interesting experience. And I was so appreciative of the fact that the military was so open to supporting their members so carefully. I still contribute to the Jewish Chaplains Fund and get a kick out of the fact that there are MREs that are kosher for Passover. I mean, I think that's just a wonderful military thing. So I appreciate your military thing, but I want to say that, I have to say, you asked this question, when do you feel like an insider or an outsider? I'm feeling a little like an outsider right now, tonight, with this, right here. In those 10 commitments that you just read, which I think were fascinating, I'm good with 1 through 9.
Yeah.
My 10 is raise your children Jewish. My children are Catholic. It's a complicated story. It has to do with the fact that I came to appreciate my Judaism later in life. Does that mean I'm not Jewish or less Jewish or an outsider in some way?
Let me put before you, I mean, it's interesting because I was thinking about your kids as part of, and when you were talking about West Point, Nathan,
Devlin, West Point, yeah.
Devlin, whose last name is Winkelstein,
yes,
and he keeps kosher, right?
Yes.
Had to make a sign when he was at West Point. And the sign that he pulled out of his pocket was, I'm not, my father is, I do this to honor him, right? Because he got so many questions about who he was, right, with the last name of Winkelstein. So, Peter, you have done more to promote Jewish learning in Jewish communities for a lot of Jewish kids and a lot of Jewish adults than many other people I've met who have Jewish great-grandchildren. There are many ways of fulfilling that, and I would say that it's not an honest presentation of Judaism to take out Lador Vador. To say that from generation to generation is not a fundamental Jewish value would not be honest. To say that it has to be produced biologically, I mean, the teacher that I worked with most closely in Maryland the two teachers never had children of their own and did more on behalf of their, she's a national treasure as a tutor, and he is more influenced more Jewish kids. So, through what you have done in your life, in your being part of Jewish communities, I see you as fulfilling that commandment and allowing Jewish continuity. Okay. I love your
Can I
kids,
ask,
and I've been at 2 of their Catholic weddings.
Michael, can I ask, what happens if you bring your children up Jewish, they're bar mitzvah, they marry non-Jewish girls, and then they bring their children up not Jewish? Are you fulfilling that?
Who's the you here? I do have a question that haunts me. One answer to the question, every generation has had arguments about whether what we do Jewishly is authentic or not. And every generation has people who say that what I do is authentic and what you do isn't. So that's nothing new. One of the better answers I've heard to it, but it doesn't answer Peter's question or yours, is the following. One of the answers I've heard is, you know, if what you're doing is Jewishly authentic, if your Jewish great-grandchildren say it was Jewishly authentic. In other words, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you have Jewish great-grandchildren. Now, the problem I have with that is that we have learned that people are our identity is partly individual and not just communal. And so Peter's Jewish life is authentic in and of itself and not just for, he happens to have 4 of the greatest kids in the world, but actually you have 5 kids, right? No, right. Just kidding, right? The answer is we do what we can, and we can't always control what other people's prices are, is what I would say. Rachel, is this hitting home, or is it bothering you, or how are you with this?
I have a lot of thoughts, but no, it's hitting home. I'm interested, and thank you, Peter, for sharing that. That was really interesting to me as well. I felt like an outsider in my own family, and when I was little, I would get sick every time I went to synagogue, like physically ill. I felt so uncomfortable there. Yeah, and so I don't usually go. But listening to you say that maybe everyone feels uncomfortable at some point or another, and
Not supposed to feel sick, but yes.
well, yeah, I'm a little bit of a sensitive lady, so
okay.
but I'm really interested too in these 10 commitments, and I have a quick question, which was just there's no mention of God, and I'm wondering about that, because for me that was what made me uncomfortable at synagogue, and so I'm wondering in those 10 commitments that you created and your friend created, which I loved, why there's no mention of monotheism or God.
Well, Ellen wrote in the chat, and I included it, in great deference to her father, who was all about ideas. This is the central paradox of Jewish life. I think the central paradox of Jewish life is that we invented the idea of the world, of the one God, and I do think we invented it, even though we also sensed it, right? And yet you do not need to believe in God to be Jewish. And that was part of what I was trying to get at with faith and folk last week. What I will share with you is this. This is what allowed me to be religious. So Rachel, I'm giving you a very personal answer. Immanuel Kant made a distinction between the world the way it really is and the world the way we perceive it to be. The noumenal world, the world as it is, and the phenomenological world. And Kant said that you can't, pun unintended, we can't know anything for sure about the world the way it really is. Therefore, all our statements of God about any religion, we may sense, we may think, we may feel, and this is the subject of next week, is foundations of faith. We may, that God exists, but as soon as we start describing God, we're already only in the world of the way that human beings experience it. In other words, all religions are social constructs. The question is, if we just made this stuff up, how come you can't take one piece from one religion, one piece from another religion, and a third piece from a third, and put it all together? And there's a complicated answer to that. And it goes back to the peace bridge between Canada and the United States that I showed earlier. The houses in Fort Erie look a little different. Why do they look a little? It's the metric system, right? So that if there's nothing wrong with the metric system, there's nothing wrong with the American system, whatever it's called, right? But they're different systems. So that even though religions are social constructs, you can't just take one part of one religion, smush it together with one part of another religion and say that it will cohere, right? So the God question is a very powerful one. We're going to look at 3 models next week of how we approach faith. We're going to look at the same text that we started last week with, Genesis chapter 12, all over again, the same 9 verses. And then we're going to look at interpretations of Abraham. Why did God choose Abraham? It doesn't say. Why did Abraham choose God? It doesn't say. One model is going to be a sort of mystery model. Sort of, it's the not knowing that's part of the power of faith. Another is going to be the Maimonides model of the intellect. That to know God is to understand how the universe works, science and spirituality together. That's Rambam. The third is going to be to acknowledge that this experience is subjective, and that's Abraham Joshua Hesch. That's a preview of next week. Let's go back quickly now to tonight's class, because I need to do a fairly quick ending as a review. There's a few things I'm skipping that I had planned, but there are many ways to belong to Jewish community. These different portals of entry and relationship can involve different emphasis on what Judaism and being part of the Jewish community is about. So one of these, the Ruth model, is based on relationships. The other one, the model of the formal procedure, is sort of the full and complete stepping in. And the other is the recognition that there are Jews who are different from each other, even Jews who are born Jewish who feel outside, but there are sort of, there's the sort of mid status, and that was the category that Kendra referred to her as herself as part of the Jewish community last week. She said, well, what about the status of sort of resident alien? And the word alien, of course, has other connotations in our lives, so relationship, institutional affiliation, and the sort of insider-outsider model. Any reactions or thoughts, closing comments about tonight?
At some future point, I would like to hear more about your views and general views on why our relationship with Israel is considered to be so important, because it seems to me that that is something that is unique to Judaism, that there's this connection with this country, this place, and I realize it's more of a symbol in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of history there, but it creates a lot of confusion and controversy also, because it gets mixed up with Israeli politics and how people feel about that. And so yeah. I think that's something that I would like to be able to explore at some point in this process.
It's really important. I don't know if we're tackling it head on in the obviously a lot of the other Hartman material that we did, the idea of two homes and homeland and home. There's a lot of material. A quick answer while standing on one foot on that. The very fact that we are using the term peoplehood, we are a people, we are a faith as folk as well as a faith. Peoplehood involves communal affiliation. even if you don't share the same beliefs, if you have the same identity. Israel is the state of the Jewish people, not the center of Judaism. The state of the Jewish people, the way that Ireland is the state of the Irish people. In that way, modern Israel, anyway, emerges out of the entire picture, which Americans don't get, of European nationalism. But Israel is the homeland, but it is different from Ireland in other ways as well. I do believe, this is the central thing that I believe, that I can't prove easily, and without having been to Israel, I can say, many, not all, but most people, when they go to Israel, get this, and beforehand, it's all just words. Israel is our past, our present, and our future, even if our future is inextricably bound up with the other place we call home here in the United States or Virgin Islands or wherever that you call home as well. It is Jewish history and it is Jewish destiny. And it is the only place in the world with as an autonomous Jewish state, it is the only place with a majority culture that is Jewish. And so all of the values of Jewish life that are developed in the Talmud are developed at a time of powerlessness. So the question is, what do we do with power? What do we do when we create a Jewish society that has minorities in it, but creating a Jewish society? So those are some of the cutting edge questions that apply to Israel and its connection. My son Benjamin wrote an essay for a college he did not get into, and I think he should have, about he thought that when he was in college, he should be able to join the pro-Israel group and the pro-Palestinian group at the same time. That there is no inherent contradiction between being in favor of both peoples. I loved that. I cherish that idealism. There are reasons institutionally why that is more challenging, but to support Israel does not mean to support every policy of every Israeli government. And just as the dissent from an American government can be very important as an act of American patriotism, so too can an expression of progressive Zionism be a dissent from the current Israeli government as an important expression of Zionist values. Anyway, that's the quickest answer I can give to that, and it wasn't very quick. Any other closing comments for tonight? We are observing, because we may be with somebody who's a vegetarian for Thanksgiving, we are observing Canadian Thanksgiving. We are doing so tonight, except that I have a 9:30 Zoom call with a tutor for an upcoming life cycle event here. So I am going to say goodnight now. Any closing comments from anyone else? David Weber, you get to introduce yourself at the beginning of class next week.
Okay.
All right.
Very good.
All right.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you,
everybody.
Michael.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Hello.